The glass doors hissed open, releasing a rush of cool, conditioned air into the heat outside. An old man stepped inside, his shoes worn, his beige shirt a little faded at the collar. He paused at the sight of the gleaming showroom, rows of polished machines, each one reflecting the ceiling lights like jewels. He tightened his grip on the small notebook in his hand. Before he could even reach the first display, a salesman intercepted him. The man's smile was thin, stretched, and quickly replaced by a smirk as his eyes scanned the old man from head to toe. "Sir, I think you may be in the wrong place," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We don't rent cars here. These are exclusive models, very expensive." A few customers chuckled from nearby. The old man's face burned, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm only asking about accessibility features," he explained softly, almost apologetically. "I have a few questions." The salesman waved his hand dismissively. "Accessibility? Look, these cars aren't made for that, and honestly, I doubt they'd be within your budget. Maybe try a used lot down the road." His laughter was sharp enough to draw the attention of others. A younger employee leaned against a counter, whispering something to his colleague, and both erupted in muffled laughter. For a moment, the old man stood frozen, his notebook trembling in his grip. His eyes darted around the showroom, catching the stares, some amused, some pitying, none kind. A woman in high heels walked past him, her perfume lingering in the air, and muttered just loud enough, "What a joke." The humiliation pressed down on him like a weight. His chest tightened. He felt the urge to defend himself, to explain why he was really there, but his voice caught in his throat. He turned toward the exit, each step heavy, each movement watched by eyes that had already judged and dismissed him. Outside, the sunlight was blinding. He leaned against the wall, inhaling slowly, steadying himself. He thought of leaving, of burying the shame deep enough so no one would ever know. Yet somewhere behind the ache, a spark flickered. Tomorrow, the world would see a very different side of this old man, something no one in that dealership could have imagined. The old man had always carried himself with a quiet presence, like someone used to being overlooked but never bitter about it. His name was Elias Benjamin Hart. For decades, he had lived in the same modest brick house on the outskirts of the city, the kind with a creaking porch swing and a vegetable garden that he tended every morning at sunrise. Neighbors knew him as polite, always ready with a nod or a helping hand, but few knew the depth of what he had built. Years earlier, Elias had founded the Bridgewheel Foundation, a non-profit that designed affordable adaptation kits to transform ordinary cars into vehicles accessible for the elderly and people with disabilities. The idea had been born from personal pain. His father, once strong and independent, had lost much of his mobility after a stroke. Elias refused to accept that dignity had to end with illness. He spent nights in his garage, tinkering with metal scraps and discarded tools, sketching blueprints on napkins and envelopes. What started as a homemade contraption became a revolutionary system, lightweight, durable, and easy to install. The first kit changed his father's life. The second was gifted to a neighbor. Word spread quietly, and soon strangers began knocking on his door, desperate for solutions. Elias never charged a dime in those early days. He believed access to mobility was a right, not a privilege. Eventually, donations trickled in and the foundation took shape. He turned garages into workshops, partnered with retired mechanics, and trained volunteers. Over the years, thousands of vehicles were adapted, each carrying a story of restored freedom. One particular story remained etched in Elias's heart. A boy named Mateo Ruiz, only 12, lived with his mother in the back of a laundromat. Mateo had a congenital condition that left him unable to walk, and his mother couldn't afford specialized transportation. Elias heard about them through a volunteer and didn't hesitate. He packed a kit into his old pickup and drove 9 hours straight, arriving at the laundromat just before dawn. He still remembered Mateo's laughter when he was lifted into the front seat of a newly adapted van for the very first time. That laughter echoed in Elias's memory whenever exhaustion made him doubt the weight of his mission. Despite this legacy, Elias never sought recognition. He refused interviews, avoided cameras, and donated under pseudonyms. When people insisted on praising him, he would change the subject, often pointing to his wife, Clara Mendel Hart, as his anchor. Clara worked as a librarian at a public school, her world filled with the smell of old books and the curious questions of children. She was steady, sharp, and endlessly patient. While Elias carried the technical vision, Clara grounded him with words, reminding him that even unseen efforts had meaning. Together, they had chosen a life of simplicity. No luxury cars, no tailored suits, just purpose. Yet this simplicity was the very reason strangers judged him. In rooms lined with polished marble and glass, like the dealership the day before, he looked like a man out of place. His clothes, practical and worn, told none of his story. His hands, rough from years of work, carried no hint of boardrooms or Wall Street deals. And so people laughed. They whispered. They dismissed him. What they couldn't see, what Elias never advertised, was that the Bridgewheel Foundation had become a silent force of innovation. Industry leaders quietly sought his advice. Universities cited his designs. Even hospitals referred families to his organization. Elias's impact rippled far beyond his modest life, touching communities across the country, though most would never know his name. That evening, after the humiliation, Elias sat at his kitchen table, staring at his notebook. Clara placed a cup of tea beside him without a word. He scribbled diagrams and notes, not to prove anything, but because creating solutions was how he breathed. His heart was bruised, yes, but it still beat for others. And tomorrow, that same heartbeat would set in motion something far bigger than he had ever planned. The morning after the humiliation, Elias rose early, as he always did. The sun spilled across his small garden, catching on the dew that clung to the tomato vines. He carried a watering can, moving slowly but deliberately, as though tending to the soil could steady his own shaken spirit. Clara watched him from the porch, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. She didn't press him with questions. She never did. Instead, she offered the kind of silence that felt like shelter. To the world, Elias was just an old man in worn shoes. But Clara knew the weight he carried. She had seen him spend nights bent over blueprints, hands stained with grease, driven by an invisible compass that pointed always toward compassion. She often teased him, saying, "You look like a man trying to solve the world with duct tape and stubbornness." He would smile at that because she wasn't entirely wrong. Later that day, he drove his battered pickup into the city. The contrast was almost cinematic, his rusted truck pulling into traffic beside luxury sedans and sleek convertibles. People glanced, some with mild disdain, others without noticing him at all. Elias didn't mind. He had learned long ago that the surface of things rarely revealed their truth. He parked near a small cafe, the same one he had walked to the day before after being mocked at the dealership. Inside, the barista, Lena Ortiz, greeted him with a curious look. She remembered how shaken he had seemed yesterday. Today, though, his presence felt steadier, though his eyes carried a quiet storm. Elias ordered only a black coffee, leaving a folded envelope at the counter. Lena unfolded it after he left. Inside was a donation slip, unsigned, covering repairs for the cafe's broken wheelchair ramp. She blinked, startled. How could someone who looked so ordinary leave behind such a gift? Across town, another ripple formed. At a mechanic's garage, Elias met with Diego Alvarez, a young apprentice he had been mentoring quietly. Diego had grown up in a rough neighborhood, his path uncertain until Elias offered him a chance. He taught Diego not only about engines, but about patience, about seeing value where others only saw rust. Diego knew little about Elias's broader foundation, only that this old man had a way of turning broken things into hope. That afternoon, Elias stopped at the local library to walk Clara home. A group of children ran past, waving at her. One little girl tugged Elias's sleeve and whispered, "Thank you for the chair." Clara smiled, realizing another family must have received help from the foundation. Elias only patted the girl's hand and said nothing. He preferred it that way. At home, as the evening settled in, Elias opened a letter from the Asterian Mobility Group. They wanted to finalize details of a partnership he had been quietly advising on, an initiative that would take his adaptation kits nationwide. The thought of it stirred both pride and unease. He remembered the sting of humiliation from the dealership, the echo of laughter in that sterile showroom. A bitter voice inside him whispered, "Why keep giving when the world only sneers?" He sat in silence, the letter trembling in his hand. For a moment, even Clara's presence couldn't chase away the doubt. He wondered if being good was worth the pain of being dismissed, of being treated as invisible. But then, a memory surfaced. Mateo Ruiz, laughing in the front seat of that van. The boy's joy had been pure, unfiltered. Elias exhaled, the doubt lifting just enough to remind him why he could not stop. He folded the letter, slipped it back into its envelope, and looked at Clara. "Tomorrow," he said softly, almost to himself, "things might change." And somewhere deep down, beneath layers of humility and restraint, Elias knew that the world was about to see what they had overlooked for far too long. In the neighborhood where Elias lived, life moved at an unhurried rhythm. Kids played soccer in the street, neighbors exchanged brief waves, and the mailman knew every dog by name. To them, Elias was simply the old man with the garden. Few realized how far his influence reached, yet even in his community, he often went unnoticed. At the grocery store, people brushed past him in line, impatient with his careful counting of change. At the post office, a clerk sighed audibly when he asked about shipping times, as if his questions were a waste of time. Elias never argued. He would lower his gaze, thank them politely, and step aside. To most, he was invisible, a man fading into the background of daily life. But little by little, things began to shift. At the cafe, the manager, Ruth Kim, discovered the repaired wheelchair ramp completed overnight. She knew the funding hadn't come from her budget, nor from the city. Pinned to the ramp was a small note. For those who deserve access without asking. Ruth turned the slip over in her hands, unsettled. Who had done this, and why so quietly? Meanwhile, Lena, the young barista, noticed that the same old man returned each morning. He never lingered, never spoke much, but always left a folded slip of paper tucked under his coffee cup. Some were donations, others small thank-you notes for the staff. She caught herself waiting for him, curiosity gnawing at her. He wasn't like the other customers who barked orders or scrolled their phones impatiently. There was something about the way he carried himself, like someone who'd weathered storms but still chose kindness. In the dealership, however, whispers lingered. The humiliation had not gone unseen. Diego Alvarez, the apprentice mechanic, had captured part of the incident on his phone. At first, he wasn't sure if he should share it, but the more he replayed the clip, the salesman's smirk, the chuckles in the background, the old man's quiet dignity, the more it unsettled him. That night, he posted a short anonymous clip online without names, without tags. Just a caption, "This is how we treat people who don't look wealthy enough." The video gained traction, not millions of views yet, but enough to spark conversations in corners of the internet where empathy still lived. Some debated, others criticized the dealership, but most simply asked the same haunting question: who was that man? Diego found himself thinking about it long after. He remembered how Elias had once shown him a trick with an old engine, teaching him patience instead of mocking his mistakes. He recalled how Elias had insisted on sharing his sandwich during a long shift. Diego began to wonder if he had underestimated someone extraordinary, hiding in plain sight. Elsewhere, other quiet signs began to ripple. A family arrived at the hospital in a newly adapted car, the kind of modification only the Bridgewheel Foundation provided. Nurses whispered that someone had covered the cost. Parents cried, relieved their child could finally travel with dignity. No one mentioned Elias by name, but the invisible threads pointed back to him. It was as if the universe itself was beginning to betray his anonymity, subtle clues unraveling the curtain that had kept his life in the shadows. Elias, however, remained unaware. To him, the day after the humiliation was like any other. He pruned his garden, he drank Clara's tea, he scribbled designs in his notebook. What he didn't know was that the world had already started asking questions, and soon those whispers would grow into something that neither he, nor the dealership that mocked him, could ignore. The second day after the humiliation, Elias walked into the city again, carrying only his notebook and a folded letter in his pocket. To anyone watching, he looked like a man running errands, nothing more. But quiet ripples were spreading in places he couldn't see. At the cafe, Ruth watched as Lena pulled another envelope from beneath a coffee cup. This one contained not money, but a short note written in an uneven hand. "Kindness is stronger when it is anonymous." Ruth tapped her fingers on the counter, unsettled. People didn't just leave gestures like this. She began to suspect that the man she had seen humiliated days before was not as ordinary as he seemed. Across town, Diego refreshed his phone nervously. The clip he had uploaded had now reached thousands of views. Comments multiplied. "Reminds me of my grandfather. People forget the worth behind wrinkles. This broke my heart. Who is he? I hope the dealership is exposed for this." Diego hadn't revealed the man's name, but the image of the old man standing quietly while laughter filled the showroom had struck a nerve. Some began searching, comparing details, asking if anyone knew him. For the first time, Diego realized the old man's dignity had made the video powerful. It wasn't pity people felt, but respect. Meanwhile, at a hospital in a neighboring city, a nurse named Elaine Porter noticed a van arriving with a brand new adaptation kit. The mother who stepped out couldn't stop crying, repeating that someone had covered everything. Elaine had heard of these kits before, the work of a foundation that operated almost invisibly, known only in certain circles. For the first time, she wondered if the anonymous donor and the quiet old man in that viral clip were the same person. Back in his modest home, Elias sat with Clara over dinner. She spoke about her students at the library, the books they loved, the stories they carried. Elias listened, nodding, but his mind wandered. He thought about the laughter in the dealership, the sting of humiliation still raw. A part of him wanted to withdraw, to shrink further into the background. But another part, a stronger part, reminded him of Mateo's laughter in that van, of families regaining freedom because of the kits. "Clara," he murmured, staring at his hands, "sometimes I wonder if people only see the dirt under my nails, never what they mean." She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "They don't need to see it," she said softly. "The ones who matter will feel it." And while Elias doubted, the world beyond his quiet home continued to shift. Conversations grew louder. Employees at the dealership argued in hushed tones about the video. Customers started asking questions. Journalists contacted the cafe, curious about the anonymous donor. Piece by piece, the disguise of invisibility Elias had worn for decades was unraveling. His life of quiet impact was no longer hidden. The world was on the brink of seeing him, not as the old man who didn't belong in a showroom, but as the mind and heart behind a mission that had already changed countless lives. And within 24 hours, the truth would break open, not as whispers, but as headlines that even Wall Street could not ignore. The following morning, the city woke to headlines that no one had anticipated. Financial news outlets blazed with the same announcement. Asterion Mobility Group had entered a groundbreaking partnership with one of the nation's largest automotive holdings. The deal was bold, an initiative to roll out adaptive technology across every showroom in the country, beginning immediately. At first, readers saw only the numbers, billions in projected growth, the sudden surge of stock prices, analysts declaring it a quiet revolution in mobility. But nestled deeper in those reports was a name unfamiliar to Wall Street, yet unforgettable to those who had crossed his path. Elias Benjamin Hart, senior advisor and founder of the Bridgewheel Foundation. Within hours, his face, captured in that viral clip from the dealership, was everywhere. Anchors replayed the footage of him standing quietly while laughter echoed around him, now juxtaposed against the news of his influence on the partnership. The image of the humiliated old man transformed overnight into that of the innovator whose work was reshaping an industry. Inside the dealership, chaos spread. Salesmen scrolled their phones in disbelief. One whispered, "That's him? The same guy?" Victor Lang, the manager, slammed his office door, the weight of humiliation pressing back on him. What he had dismissed as weakness was suddenly power that now defined the direction of the very company he represented. Meanwhile, in his modest kitchen, Elias sat with Clara, the newspaper open between them. His name, printed in bold, looked foreign to him. He didn't smile. Instead, he traced the ink with a calloused finger, his thoughts heavy. The night before, he had nearly thrown away the letter from Asterion. He had almost let humiliation dictate the end of his mission. "Clara," he whispered, "maybe I'm too old for this. Maybe people will only ever see me as a burden, even now." She set down her teacup, her voice calm but firm. "Do you remember Mateo's laughter? The boy in the van? That wasn't the world's approval. That was freedom. You gave him that. Don't let their laughter steal it from you." Her words steadied him. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The ache of humiliation hadn't disappeared, but something else rose to meet it. Resolve. He realized that dignity wasn't given by others. It was lived. On Wall Street, the stock for Asterion climbed so fast that trading was briefly halted. Journalists called it the accessibility spike. Social media exploded with posts comparing the dealership clip to the breaking news. Memes spread, mocking the arrogance of judging someone by appearances. A thread titled, "Never Underestimate the Quiet Ones," trended for hours, and in the comments, people shared their own stories of being overlooked. Elias watched none of it. Instead, he returned to his notebook, scribbling improvements to his designs. Clara smiled faintly at the sight, knowing that while the world finally caught up to him, he remained unchanged. But a storm was brewing in the dealership. Reporters were calling. Customers wanted statements. And Victor Lang knew that before the day ended, he would have to face the man he had humiliated, this time not as a stranger, but as the very force shaping the future of his business. By midday, the dealership that once dismissed Elias was no longer a showroom of polished silence. It was a battleground of flashing cameras and whispered rumors. Journalists pressed against the glass doors, shouting questions about the viral clip. Customers who had once smirked at the old man now glanced around nervously, as if ashamed to be seen in the same room where he had been humiliated. Victor Lang stood in his office, tugging at his collar, his confidence evaporating. The arrogance he wore so naturally now felt like a curse. He had mocked a man who was shaping the future of the very industry he claimed to understand. Worse still, he knew that Elias could end his career with a single word. But when Elias finally returned, it wasn't with fury or vengeance. He walked through the doors quietly, the same way he had 2 days earlier, still wearing his simple shirt, still carrying the same worn notebook. This time, though, the room shifted. Conversations faltered. Phones stopped recording mid-swipe. People rose instinctively, as if sensing that someone far greater than appearances suggested had entered. Victor approached, his voice brittle. "Mr. Hart, I want to apologize. I didn't know who you were." Elias studied him, his gaze steady but not cruel. "You didn't need to know who I was," he replied softly. "You only needed to see me." The words landed heavier than any accusation. A hush fell over the room. Even Bryce, the young salesman who had laughed the loudest, lowered his head, shame flooding his face. Elias turned to the reporters. His voice was calm, his posture steady. "This partnership isn't about headlines. It's about access. For veterans, for the elderly, for children who deserve to move freely. This isn't my victory, it's theirs." And then something unexpected happened. Diego Alvarez, the apprentice mechanic, stepped forward from the crowd. He held up his phone, trembling slightly. "I filmed it," he confessed. "I filmed how they treated you. I didn't know if I should post it, but people needed to see. I'm sorry if I made things worse." Elias looked at him, then shook his head gently. "You showed the truth. Sometimes the truth hurts before it heals." The cameras clicked, capturing the exchange. In that moment, the story shifted again. It was no longer just about humiliation or Wall Street. It was about redemption, about the courage to see dignity where others had refused. Outside, news anchors breathlessly reported on the old man's return. Inside, a quiet transformation began. Employees who had once ignored Elias now leaned forward, eager to listen. And in the corner, Bryce whispered almost to himself, "My dad could have used one of those kits." His words trailed off, but the weight of them lingered. Elias offered no lecture, no gloating. He simply opened his notebook, flipping to a sketch of the newest design. "Let's get to work," he said, as though the humiliation had been nothing more than a passing storm. And for those watching online, through news feeds and shaky live streams, the lesson was clear. Greatness often hides in the quiet, the overlooked, the underestimated. Narrators pause, a gentle smile in the voice. And if you've felt the pull of this story, don't let it end here. There are more stories waiting, stories of quiet strength and unexpected redemption. Subscribe and stay with us. You'll want to hear the next one. The next week, the dealership looked nothing like it had before. The marble floors still gleamed, the cars still shimmered under spotlights, but the atmosphere had changed. Where arrogance once thrived, unease lingered. Every employee now understood that the man they had ridiculed was the very reason the holding company's stock had soared, the man whose designs were reshaping the future of their industry. Yet when Elias entered again, he did not come to bask in vindication. He came quietly, wearing the same worn shoes, his shirt neatly pressed but still simple. Cameras were waiting, of course. Journalists had returned, hoping to catch a confrontation, to see anger spill into revenge. But Elias offered them none of that. Victor Lang, the manager, met him at the door with rehearsed contrition. "Mr. Hart, on behalf of the dealership, I want to sincerely apologize for the way you were treated. It was unforgivable." Elias tilted his head slightly, studying the man. "Unforgivable," he echoed. "No, it was a mistake. Mistakes can be corrected, but only if something changes." The silence that followed was heavier than any scolding. Employees shuffled awkwardly, waiting for judgment, but Elias did not come to strip them down. He came to build something new. "I'm not here to see anyone lose their job," Elias continued. "What I am here for is a promise, your commitment that this place and every showroom like it will become more than a temple to wealth. It must be a door to access, to dignity, to respect. Gasps rippled as he opened his notebook and placed sketches on the nearest desk. They weren't diagrams of punishment, but blueprints for training programs, plans for hiring veterans, teaching staff to serve clients with disabilities, and integrating adaptive kits into their sales packages. It wasn't vengeance. It was vision. One of the younger employees, Bryce, swallowed hard. He had been the one who laughed the loudest that day. Now he spoke with a voice cracked by regret. My father, he lost the ability to drive after his stroke. We never thought there'd be a way back for him. If I'd known who you were, He stopped, ashamed of the words. Elias cut him off gently. If you had known who I was, you might have treated me differently. That is exactly the problem. The sentence landed with the force of a hammer, but Elias's tone carried no malice. It was a truth offered like a mirror, forcing every person in the room to look at themselves. In the corner, Diego Alvarez, the apprentice, watched with quiet pride. He had risked sharing the video, and now he witnessed firsthand the change it had ignited. He raised his hand nervously. If you'll let me, Mr. Hart, I want to learn how to install those kits. Not just fix engines, actually build something that matters. A rare smile tugged at Elias's lips. Then you'll be the first trainee. Cameras clicked, reporters scribbled, but none of them could capture the full weight of the moment. A man who had been mocked now shaping the culture of the very place that had humiliated him. And still, he stood without gloating, without revenge, only with the steady resolve of someone who believed in change more than in payback. The following days turned the dealership into something it had never been before, a place of learning. For the first time, employees weren't just rehearsing sales pitches for luxury packages. They were attending workshops, studying diagrams, and even practicing how to assist customers with dignity instead of suspicion. And at the center of it all was the man they had once ridiculed. Elias stood in front of a whiteboard, chalk dust on his fingers, explaining how an adaptation kit could be installed in under 2 hours. His voice was patient, measured, carrying the weight of decades of experience. Victor Lang sat in the back, taking notes like a schoolboy, humbled in a way no shareholder meeting had ever managed. When the first demonstration car rolled onto the floor, a gleaming sedan now fitted with the bridge wheel system, the room went silent. An older veteran in a wheelchair had been invited to test it. As the mechanisms lifted and secured him smoothly into the driver's seat, his face lit up with tears he tried to hide. Cameras caught it. Employees felt it. And Bryce, the young salesman, turned away, wiping his eyes. The man who had once laughed at Elias now understood, too late, the cruelty of his assumptions. Reporters crowded around, hoping Elias would deliver a triumphant statement, something sharp to puncture the pride of the dealership. Instead, he simply said, "This isn't about me. It's about making sure no one is ever turned away because of how they look, or how much they earn, or what their body can no longer do. Respect should not be an upgrade. It should be standard." The quote spread faster than the original clip of his humiliation. Within hours, it was trending, shared by advocates, veterans groups, parents of disabled children, even business leaders who admired the quiet force of his words. For once, Wall Street didn't just care about numbers, it cared about dignity. Behind the cameras, Clara stood, watching her husband with quiet pride. She had seen him nearly break, questioning if being good was worth the pain, and now she saw him prove, not to the world, but to himself, that goodness carried its own strength. As the crowd began to disperse, Victor approached Elias once more. His voice trembled with something that sounded almost like gratitude. "You could have destroyed me, but instead, you've given me a chance to change." Elias closed his notebook and looked him in the eye. "Then don't waste it." It was not forgiveness wrapped in sentimentality. It was responsibility, placed squarely on Victor's shoulders. And for the first time in his career, the manager felt the weight of what true leadership looked like. That night, as the city buzzed with talk of stocks and headlines, Elias walked home with Clara. Their pace was slow, deliberate, the air filled with the smell of rain on warm pavement. For him, victory was not in the humiliation reversed, but in the seeds of transformation planted. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this was not the end of his story. It was only a chapter. The world had finally begun to see what had been there all along. The story of Elias Benjamin Hart didn't end with applause, nor with the downfall of those who mocked him. It ended with something quieter and far more powerful, a shift in perspective. In the weeks following the partnership announcement, Dealerships across the country began preparing to implement the adaptive kits. Some employees approached the task with hesitation, others with curiosity. But as the first cars rolled out and families experienced freedom they had thought impossible, resistance melted into conviction. The truth had become undeniable. The technology wasn't just about cars, it was about people. For Elias, however, life remained simple. He still woke early to water his garden. He still sat at the kitchen table with Clara, sipping tea while scribbling notes into his weathered notebook. Fame hadn't touched him. It couldn't. His dignity was rooted too deeply in service to be swayed by headlines. What had changed, though, was the way others saw him. Strangers greeted him with recognition, some with gratitude, others with regret. Yet Elias never sought to remind them of their past blindness. He believed people could grow, just as soil could recover after a harsh season. One evening, he returned to the same cafe where he had once hidden his humiliation. The ramp he had funded was now being used daily, and Lena greeted him with a smile that carried more than politeness. It carried respect. Ruth, the manager, thanked him quietly for what he had done. Elias only nodded, ordering his usual black coffee. As he sat by the window, he noticed a young boy guiding his grandmother up the ramp with ease. The boy grinned as though it were the most natural thing in the world. For Elias, that was enough. The lesson of his journey was not about triumph over enemies or proving doubters wrong. It was about seeing what others refused to see, that every human being carries worth beyond appearances, that laughter at someone else's expense reveals more about the mocker than the mocked, that humility and vision can change an industry, not with thunder, but with persistence. Elias once told Clara, "Respect should never be conditional.